What if the world told you your dreams were impossible yet you turned rejection into a story that touched millions? We've all had moments when life seemed heavy, when the odds stacked against us felt unshakable. But sometimes, in the darkest hours, our greatest stories are born. Today, we'll journey through the inspiring rise of J.K. Rowling. How a single mother on welfare became one of the most successful authors in history, and how her story can light a fire in your own. It's a cold, gray day in Edinburgh. A young woman sits in a tiny cafe, her fingers freezing as she scribbles on worn paper. Outside, life rushes past people with jobs, with warmth, with certainty, but she has none of these. She's a single mother, living on welfare, battling depression so deep it feels like an anchor pulling her under. Yet in her mind, a boy with messy black hair and round glasses is waiting to be born. His world is filled with magic, courage, and hope, the very things she's losing grip on. She writes because she must, because it's the only spark keeping her alive. When she finishes her manuscript, she sends it to publishers. 1 rejection, 2, 5, 10, 12. Every letter says the same thing. No doubt most people would have stopped. But she didn't. Finally, a small publishing house agrees to take a chance. Her book hits shelves and slowly, something incredible happens. Children fall in love with Harry Potter. Parents read along, swept into the magic. The story spreads across the globe, breaking records and selling hundreds of millions of copies. The woman who once couldn't afford heating now builds libraries, supports charities, and inspires dreamers worldwide. She didn't just write a book, she rewrote her life. The rain fell softly against the old windows of the small house in Yate, a market town on the outskirts of Bristol. It was the kind of English afternoon where the sky seemed to press low, heavy with gray clouds, as if the entire world had been wrapped in a woolen blanket. Inside, a little girl with bright eyes and a tangle of brown hair sat cross-legged on the carpet, surrounded by a kingdom of paper scraps, colored pencils, and half-finished stories. Her name was Joanne. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old, but already, her mind was a place where dragons guarded mountains of treasure. Brave girls outsmarted evil wizards, and rabbits held parties in underground burrows. The world outside was ordinary brick houses, tiny gardens, the occasional barking dog, but in her mind, magic lived just beneath the surface of everything. She would watch the steam curling from her mother's teacup and imagine it was the breath of a miniature dragon, invisible to everyone else. When the postman's shadow appeared on the frosted glass of the front door, she'd wondered if he was secretly a messenger from another realm, delivering enchanted letters only she could decode. The living room smelled faintly of tea, old books, and rain-damp wool from her father's coat hanging by the door. Joanne's mother, Anne, often encouraged her stories, listening with patient smiles as her daughter spun elaborate plots about witches in disguise and forests that whispered warnings to those who dared enter. Her father, Peter, sometimes teased her, "You'll be a writer one day, Joe. Mark my words," and she grinned, not quite understanding how much truth there was in that prophecy. She had a little sister, Diane, who was still too young to understand the worlds Joanne built, but who followed her around faithfully, clutching the stuffed bear as if it were her passport into these adventures. The sisters would sit in their small bedroom, the walls covered in fading wallpaper patterned with tiny flowers, and Joanne would tell stories until the shadows in the corners seemed to come alive. One rainy Saturday, she took an empty cereal box, cut it open, and began to draw. On one panel, she sketched a castle with crooked towers and windows like watchful eyes. On another, she scribbled creatures with wings too small for their bodies, smiling as they tumbled through a sky filled with golden stars, her fingers smudged. With pencil and crayon, she felt a rush of something she couldn't name, something like power. In this world she was building, she was in control. She could make heroes and villains, create danger, and save the day, all with the turn of a page. School was a different kind of world, one bound by rules and timetables. Joanne was a quiet child there, sometimes shy, sometimes stubborn, but always observant. While other children played tag or hopscotch during recess, she would sit on a bench, watching the way the wind bent the grass in waves, imagining it was an ocean filled with sea serpents. Her teachers noticed her love for reading, the way she devoured books far above her age level. She read everything: fairy tales, myths, adventure stories, even her father's old history books. Every story she consumed was like a brick laid in the foundation of her imagination. At night, when the house was quiet, she'd lie in bed and stare at the ceiling, inventing characters she could talk to in her mind, She gave them voices, histories, fears, and dreams. Sometimes she'd drift off mid-conversation, waking the next morning eager to pick up where she left off. One winter, when snow blanketed the street outside in pristine white, Joanne decided to write her first full story. It was about a rabbit named Rabbit, who caught measles and was visited by friends who brought him carrots to cheer him up. The plot was simple, but to her, it was monumental. It was the first time she took the wild currents of her imagination and anchored them to paper. She showed it to her mother, who read it aloud with a gentle warmth that made Joanne's chest swell with pride. But not every day was warm and safe. Joanne's childhood had its shadows, times when her parents' arguments echoed down the hallway, when loneliness crept in despite the world she carried inside her head. Yet, even then, stories were her refuge. When the air in the house felt tense, she retreated to her room, closed the door, and opened the gateway to somewhere better. By the time she was 8, she was not just telling stories, she was living them. She'd imagined herself as the heroine of her own adventure, armed with wit and courage, navigating dangers that mirrored the real fears she didn't yet know how to name. When her family moved to the Gloucestershire countryside, she saw the change not as a disruption, but as a new chapter. The fields became kingdoms, the hedgerows walls of fortresses, the narrow lanes secret passages only she knew how to traverse. In the evenings, the family would sometimes gather in the living room, the flicker of the television casting shadows across the walls. Joanne would sit quietly, her gaze fixed, but her mind elsewhere, maybe at the top of a mountain, facing a dragon, or sailing across a silver sea toward an island no map could find. Her inner world was so vivid that reality sometimes felt like an afterthought. And so, without realizing it, she was training for the life ahead. Every scrap of fantasy, every story told under the covers with a flashlight, every character she sketched in the margins of her schoolwork was sharpening her storytelling. Blade, the girl who once sat cross-legged on the carpet, surrounded by paper scraps, was unknowingly laying the first stones of a road that would lead her far beyond the borders of the little English town she called home. Even then, before the fame, before the struggles, before the boy wizard, she understood one unshakable truth: the world might be ordinary, but with enough imagination, you could make it extraordinary. The sun over Gloucestershire had a way of painting the fields in soft gold during late afternoons, the kind of light that made even the simplest places feel like something out of a fairy tale. For most people, it was just another rural English day, cows grazing lazily, hedgerows buzzing with life. But for young Joanne, every corner, every patch of earth seemed to whisper the beginning of a story. By now she was in primary school, a little taller, her hair often escaping whatever neat braid her mother tried to put it in. She carried a satchel worn at the edges, stuffed with exercise books, pencil stubs, and a small stash of library novels. Books were her currency, her treasures, and her escape routes. While the other children traded marbles or sweets, Joanne traded adventures, borrowing a friend's book and returning it with breathless enthusiasm about its best scenes, as if she'd just returned from the journey herself. It was in those years that storytelling moved from a private pastime to something she began to share. Her teacher, Mrs. Morgan, was a sturdy woman with spectacles that seemed to slide down her nose at will, but she had a sharp eye for talent. One rainy day, with the smell of damp coats filling the classroom, Mrs. Morgan announced a creative writing contest. The theme, a journey to a magical place. Joanne's heart thumped in her chest. Magical places weren't something she had to invent from scratch. They were already living in her mind, waiting for an invitation to step onto the page. That evening, she sat at her desk by the small bedroom window, watching the drizzle blur the view of the quiet street outside. She imagined a train station, not a real one, but a secret place where steam billowed in impossible colors, where travelers carried suitcases that sometimes wriggled and whispered. She pictured a girl boarding a train to a land where the moon spoke in riddles, and the rivers carried not water, but liquid starlight. The pencil moved quickly, her small hand aching as she wrote page after page. She didn't notice the hours slipping by, didn't hear her mother calling her for dinner until she was nearly done. When she finally looked at what she'd written, it wasn't perfect. It was a child's story, full of impossible things, but it felt alive. A week later, Mrs. Morgan read Joanne's story aloud to the class. The other children sat wide-eyed, some leaning forward, others glancing at her as if she'd just revealed a secret about herself they'd never guessed. When the story ended, the room was quiet for a moment before applause broke out. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but for Joanne, it was a lightning-striking awakening. She realized something extraordinary. Her stories could make people feel something. That realization became a hunger. She began to write more, not just for school, but for herself. Her notebooks filled with tales about lonely giants who carved mountains, about cats who could slip between worlds, about children who found secret doors in the backs of cupboards. She didn't care if anyone else read them. The act of creating them was enough. At home, she began telling bedtime stories to her sister, Diane. They would huddle under the blankets, the dark corners of the room fading away as Joanne spun new adventures night after night. Sometimes the stories lasted for weeks, each night adding a new twist, a new character, until the plot lines tangled like the roots of an ancient tree. Diane would often fall asleep halfway through, but Joanne would lie awake, thinking of where the tale could go next. There were obstacles too. Not everyone saw storytelling as something valuable. Relatives would sometimes remind her, gently but firmly, that books were nice, but real life required practical work. But even as a child, Joanne sensed that practicality without imagination was a kind of poverty no amount of money could fix. One summer afternoon, she took a walk through the fields alone, the sound of bees humming in the tall grass around her. She imagined a character walking with her, a shy but clever boy who could talk to animals. She spoke to him in whispers, asking what he thought about the clouds overhead, what secrets the hedgerows might be hiding. In her mind, he answered, and by the time she reached home, she knew him as well as she knew herself. That day she learned something vital. Characters weren't just invented, they were discovered, waiting somewhere in the folds of her imagination to be found. That discovery changed how she approached stories. They became less about creating something from nothing, and more about uncovering what was already there. She began carrying a small notebook everywhere, scribbling fragments, a snatch of dialogue she overheard in a shop, the way rain pulled in a cracked paving stone, the smell of fresh bread from the bakery. Every detail was potential magic, and she was learning to see the world as raw material for her craft. Years later, when she would look back on her life, she'd see these moments as the earliest sparks, small, glowing embers that would one day ignite into a fire strong enough to carry her through some of the darkest chapters of her life. But in the moment, she was just a girl in love with stories, unaware that her quiet obsession was building the foundation for something the whole world would one day know. The seed had been planted, the sparks had been struck. Now all that was needed was time and the courage to follow where they led. The first signs that childhood would not last forever often come quietly, without announcement. For Joanne, they began as subtle changes in the air at home, things she couldn't quite name at the time, but felt deep in her bones. It was the late 1970s, and the Rowling family had moved into a modest house in the countryside, far from the busier streets of Yate. To a child, the new home seemed like an adventure, fields that stretched into the horizon, lanes that wound like curious trails, and an ancient yew tree at the edge of their property that looked as though it had been there for centuries, watching over generations. But inside those walls, something was shifting. Her mother, Anne, once full of warmth and gentle energy, had started to tire more easily. At first, it was nothing alarming, just moments when she'd need to rest in the middle of the day, or when she'd lean on the kitchen counter longer than usual after carrying laundry upstairs. Joanne would notice her mother's hands trembling slightly when she poured tea, or the way her smile sometimes didn't quite reach her eyes. Her father, Peter, was a man of precision, an aircraft engineer, the kind who liked things ordered and predictable. Illness was neither. When it began visiting doctors more frequently, Peter became quieter, retreating into his workshop or behind the rustle of the newspaper. Joanne didn't understand it then, but silence could be a form of fear. Life outside the house went on as if nothing was wrong. At school, Joanne continued to excel in reading and storytelling. Though she carried an invisible weight with her, she found herself writing more about brave characters who faced great dangers, not because she consciously connected them to her life, but because some part of her was beginning to sense that danger was coming. The day the diagnosis came, the atmosphere in the house shifted permanently and had multiple sclerosis, a disease the young Joanne couldn't fully comprehend but quickly understood was serious. There were no dramatic scenes at first, just the quiet adjustments, her mother walking slower, the presence of more medication bottles on the kitchen shelf, the careful way her father would guide her mother's arm as they crossed the room. Joanne reacted the way she knew best. She escaped into stories. When reality felt too heavy, she would disappear into her bedroom and create worlds where illness didn't exist, where mothers were invincible, and where every challenge had a magical solution. But as she grew older, she began to understand that her stories were also a way to practice courage, a place to rehearse facing fears she wasn't yet ready to meet in real life. Her relationship with her mother deepened during this time and was patient, even as her body betrayed her. She encouraged Joanne's writing with a kind of urgency, as though she understood perhaps better than her daughter did, that this passion was more than a hobby, it was a lifeline. There were afternoons when I would sit in a chair by the window, wrapped in a cardigan, listening as Joanne read aloud her latest creation. Even on the days when fatigue dulled her eyes, she listened as though every word mattered. But illness isn't just a physical burden, it has a way of stretching the fabric of a family. Peter and his marriage, already marked by differences in temperament, began to fray. Arguments became more frequent, sometimes muffled behind closed doors, sometimes sharp enough to pierce through walls. For Joanne, the raised voices were like cracks in the foundation of her world. She would sit at the kitchen table with Diane, both of them quiet, pretending to focus on homework while their parents' words rose and fell like distant thunder. By her teenage years, Joanne was no stranger to loss not of people, but the certainty that life would remain steady. Friends at school might complain about trivial things, parents not buying the right trainers, or arguments over television channels, but Joanne carried something heavier. She became more introspective, more attuned to the moods of others, and more determined to find meaning in the chaos. And then came the first real goodbye. It wasn't to her mother Anne's illness would stretch on for years, but to her grandmother, Kathleen, with whom Joanne had been close. Kathleen's passing was a lesson in the finality of things. Joanne had always known, in the abstract, that people didn't live forever, but the sharp ache of loss was something else entirely. She stood at the funeral, the winter air cutting through her coat, and felt an emptiness that no story could quite fill. Later, in the quiet of her room, she wrote about a kingdom where the stars were lanterns lit by those who had passed away, watching over the living. It was her way of keeping her grandmother close. The cracks in her family life continued to widen. By the time Joanne was preparing for university, the emotional distance between her and her father had grown. They loved each other, but there was an unspoken space between them, a space filled with things unsaid, moments missed, and the weight of everything they'd been through. Still, in the middle of the struggle and loss, there was resilience. Joanne learned that life didn't pause for grief, it carried you forward, whether you were ready or not. And perhaps most importantly, she learned that pain could be transformed. In her stories, she began to write characters who endured hardship not as victims, but as survivors. She didn't know it yet, but these seeds of resilience would one day shape the boy wizard who lived in a cupboard and faced a world determined to break him. By the time she stepped into adulthood, Joanne carried with her the bittersweet knowledge that love and loss were two sides of the same coin, and that imagination was not just a gift, but a shield. It was this understanding, painful, profound, and unshakable, that would later give her writing its depth and its heart. It was the summer of 1990, and the English countryside was rolling past in a blur of green fields and hedgerows. The train from Manchester to London was moving steadily, its rhythmic clatter on the tracks almost hypnotic. Joanne Rowling sat in her seat, her bag tucked beside her, a notebook in her lap. She had planned to spend the journey working on one of the stories she'd been tinkering with for weeks, but the pen in her hand was idle. Somewhere between the departure and the halfway point, the train slowed unexpectedly. A voice crackled over the loudspeaker. There was a delay ahead. The train would be stopped for a while. A ripple of frustration moved through the carriage. Sighs, shifting feet, muttered complaints. Joanne simply leaned back in her seat, her gaze drifting to the window. The landscape beyond was ordinary enough: patches of farmland, the occasional cluster of houses, a sky streaked with low-hanging clouds. But something about the stillness began to stir her mind. It was as if the pause in the journey had opened a door she hadn't realized was there. And through that door stepped a boy. She didn't know his name yet, only that he was small and thin, with messy black hair that looked like it had never been properly combed. He wore round glasses, and there was something in his eyes, something that spoke of both wonder and sadness. He was not standing in the fields outside the train window. He was on another train, one she could see only in her mind. That train wasn't heading to London. It was heading somewhere far more extraordinary. Joanne's mind began to race. She saw compartments filled with laughing children in robes, an old witch pushing a trolley piled high with sweets she'd never heard of before: chocolate frogs, Bertie Bott's every flavor beans. She saw a castle, towering and ancient, its windows glowing with golden light against the night sky. She saw owls swooping through the air, delivering letters written in emerald green ink. And that boy, yes, she knew now his name was Harry. Harry Potter. He wasn't just a character. He was someone she felt she had known her whole life. Even though he had just walked into her imagination, the train jolted slightly, and Joanne blinked. Almost disoriented, she reached for her pen, ready to capture it all, but realized with a rush of panic that she didn't have any paper. Not a scrap. The notebook she brought was full, every page already covered with unrelated drafts. So she sat there, gripping the pen in her hand, forcing herself to remember every detail, every face, every spell, every room in that castle until the images were burned into her mind. She would not lose this story. The delay stretched on. Outside, the sky began to darken into evening, and the train's windows reflected the dim lights inside the carriage in that reflected glass. Joanne could almost see him sitting across from her, watching her with quiet curiosity. The connection was so strong it felt real, as if the two of them were sharing the same journey, each on their way to a destiny neither could quite see yet. When the train finally lurched forward again, Joanne's heart was pounding not with impatience over the delay, but with exhilaration. She knew she had just met someone who would change her life forever. She didn't know how or when, but she felt it as surely as she felt the train moving beneath her. By the time she reached London, she had the bare bones of a story that would take 7 books to tell. A story about a boy who didn't know he was special until the day a letter arrived to tell him he was destined for something greater. Over the next few days, she began writing down everything she could remember from that moment on the train. Names came quickly: Ron, Hermione, Dumbledore, Hagrid. Places began to take shape: Diagon Alley, the Forbidden Forest, the Quidditch pitch. She sketched the layout of the school, mapped out its secret passageways, and built a calendar for its school year. It was intoxicating, the way this world unfolded. She didn't have to force it. It arrived fully alive, as if it had simply been waiting for her to notice it. Looking back years later, she would say it was the purest moment of inspiration she had ever known. A gift, and like all great gifts, it came unannounced, in the most ordinary of places, on a delayed train, somewhere between Manchester and London, with no paper to write it down. But that moment was more than just the birth of an idea. It was a lifeline. In the months to come, her life would be rocked by one of the greatest losses she would ever face. And Harry Potter, the boy she met on that train, would become her companion through grief, her anchor through storms she didn't yet know were coming. For now, though, she didn't think about the future. She simply wrote and wrote and wrote, as if afraid the magic might vanish if she stopped. She had no way of knowing that the world she had just begun to imagine would one day belong to millions. The air at Heathrow was thick with the hum of departures, the chatter of voices in dozens of languages, and the metallic scent of jet fuel drifting in from the runways. Joanne stood near the gate with her suitcase by her side, clutching her passport as if it were both a ticket and a promise. She had always loved stories about journeys, but this was the first time she was stepping into one that was entirely her own. It was 1991, and life in England had reached a crossroads. Her mother's illness was growing more severe, and Joanne had just endured the quiet collapse of a relationship that had left her restless and untethered. Teaching English abroad had always sounded like an adventure, a way to see the world and escape the weight of the familiar. When an opportunity rose to take a position in Porto, Portugal, she didn't hesitate. As the plane lifted off the runway, the gray sprawl of London giving way to clouds, Joanne felt a mix of exhilaration and fear. She was leaving behind everything. She knew: her family, her language, her routines, and flying toward a place she had only read about in guidebooks. In her bag, tucked between teaching materials, was a growing stack of notes about a certain boy wizard. Even as her life shifted geographically, that world was still alive in her mind. When the plane touched down in Porto, the city greeted her like an oil painting come to life. The late afternoon sun spilled gold over tiled rooftops and winding cobblestone streets. The scent of the sea mingled with the aroma of freshly baked bread from nearby bakeries. It was warmer here in climate, in color, and in the way strangers smiled when passing by. Her small apartment overlooked a narrow street, where laundry lines stretched between buildings like bunting. The nights were filled with a distant hum of music from cafes and the rhythmic crash of waves against the shore. Teaching English was challenging but rewarding. Her students were eager, curious about her homeland, and often amused by her dry British humor. She found herself learning from them as much as she taught about the culture, the food, The history embedded in every tiled wall and crumbling stone dot. It was in Porto that she met Jorge. He was a local journalist, charming in a way that felt both easy and electric. Their first meeting was at a crowded cafe near the university, the air thick with the smell of coffee and the chatter of students. He was reading a newspaper, of course, and looked up when she passed his table. Their conversation began with small talk about books, but it quickly deepened into long discussions about literature, politics, and dreams. Jorge had a storyteller's voice, smooth, deliberate, the kind that made even ordinary events sound like adventures. He was passionate, quick-witted, and unafraid to challenge her ideas. Joanne was drawn to him, not just for his charisma, but for the way he seemed to see through her hesitations, urging her to take risks, to live more boldly. Their courtship unfolded against the backdrop of Porto streets, the two of them wandering hand in hand past azulejo-tiled churches, sharing glasses of vinho verde at candlelit tables, laughing over plates of grilled sardines at seaside restaurants. There were moments that felt cinematic, the two of them riding a tram as rain streaked the windows, or standing on the Dom Luisi Bridge at night, the Douro River glittering beneath them. But life, as Joanne would learn, is rarely as simple as the first act of a love story. Beneath the warmth and excitement, there were differences, cultural, personal, and unspoken, that began to surface. George's temper could flare unexpectedly, his intensity cutting both ways. Joanne, independent and quietly stubborn, sometimes found herself retreating into silence rather than confronting tensions head-on. Still, there were good days, and on those days, they dreamed together. They talked about marriage, about building a family. Joanne imagined a future where she could write and teach, and raise children in a place filled with beauty. The boy wizard's world continued to grow in her notebooks, though at a slower pace. Now, competing with the demands of her new life. In 1992, they married. The ceremony was modest, attended by close friends and family members from both sides. For a time, married life brought a sense of stability, a belief that perhaps she had found her footing in this foreign city. When she discovered she was pregnant, the news felt like the start of a new chapter, one where she could blend the realities of motherhood with the dream she had carried since that train ride 2 years earlier. Porto, with its sunlit mornings and ocean breezes, became the backdrop for this hopeful interlude. Yet even as she prepared for motherhood, there were undercurrents she couldn't ignore. Moments when the man she loved seemed like a stranger, when words between them cut instead of connected. But Joanne had learned from her family's struggles that relationships required endurance, and she was determined to hold on. For now, she focused on the small joys, buying tiny clothes for the baby, feeling the first fluttering kicks, and imagining the stories she would tell her child. She dreamed of a life where bedtime would always come with magic, not just from the pages of her books, but in the warmth of love and safety. She didn't know then that the road ahead would shatter those dreams, and that she would have to rebuild her life from the ground up. But she also didn't know that in the process, she would find a strength she had never imagined, and that the boy with messy black hair would still be waiting for her, ready to help her through it all. The first sign that the fairy tale was starting to crack didn't come with shouting. It came with silence, the kind that hangs in the air between the people who used to talk about everything, but now move around each other like strangers sharing the same small apartment. In the early days after Jessica was born, a small, wrinkled bundle with impossibly big eyes, Joanne had thought motherhood would be the glue that would hold everything together. The apartment in Porto was now filled with the soft hum of lullabies, the smell of warm milk, and the relentless demands of a newborn. She spent nights pacing the floor, her daughter's tiny head pressed against her chest, feeling both exhausted and fiercely protective. Jorge was there in moments, but not always in the way she needed. Sometimes he was loving, even tender, kissing their baby's forehead with a rare gentleness. Other times, he was impatient, his temper surfacing in sharp words or long absences. There were arguments about money, about priorities, about how much time Joanne spent at home instead of going out. And there were darker moments when his anger seemed to come out of nowhere, leaving her feeling small and weary in her own home. The breaking point didn't come in a single explosion. It came like waves wearing down a cliff, slow, relentless, and impossible to stop. Joanne began to realize that she was living more in fear than in love. The vibrant city around her, the one she had once wandered with such joy, now felt like a maze she couldn't escape. One night, after a particularly heated argument, she found herself sitting on the bathroom floor with Jessica sleeping in her arms. the cold tile against her back. She stared at the tiny rise and fall of her daughter's chest and absolutely knew that she couldn't let this be their life. Leaving was not romantic. It was not the dramatic rush of a film scene where the heroine storms out with a suitcase. It was slow, complicated, and terrifying. Joanne had no real savings, no clear plan, and nowhere to go except back to the UK. But the idea of staying felt heavier than the risk of starting. Overdot, she began making quiet preparations, contacting her sister, looking into flights, packing in secret when Jorge was at work. Every move had to be careful. She told no one in Porto what she was planning. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. The day they left was bright and cloudless. The kind of day that should have felt like summer's promise. Joanne kept her head down as she carried Jessica through the airport, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might give her away. She didn't breathe fully until the plane's wheels lifted off Portuguese soil. When they landed in Edinburgh, the cold air felt almost like a welcome, but reality hit hard. She was back in her homeland with a baby, no job, and only a small network of support. She moved into a cramped flat and leaf-peeling paint on the walls, drafty windows, a heater that groaned more than it worked. Money was tighter than she'd ever experienced. Government assistance kept them afloat, but just barely. She rationed heat, skipped meals so Jessica could eat, and wore the same coat through winter, even when the lining had worn thin. The isolation was crushing. Days blurred into nights of feeding, changing, and rocking her daughter to sleep, often while staring at a blank wall and wondering how she would make it through the next month. But somewhere in that struggle, her resolve began to harden. She had left for her daughter's safety, but she would survive for her daughter's future. In the quiet moments when Jessica finally slept and the flat was wrapped in silence, Joanne would pull out her notebooks. She began to write again. It wasn't glamorous. She wrote at the kitchen table with a chipped mug of tea, wearing sweaters with frayed cuffs. The stories poured out, almost in defiance of her circumstances. The boy wizard was still there, waiting for her in that world of magic and friendship and courage. In a life that had become so uncertain, he was the one constant. She would take Jessica for walks in her pram along the gray, windswept streets, passing pubs glowing with warm light and shop windows, filled with things she couldn't afford. Sometimes she'd pause by the library, staring at the shelves inside and thinking about the day her own book might sit there. Her sister would visit when she could, bringing groceries or simply company. On rare afternoons, Joanne would take Jessica to a cafe, order the cheapest drink on the menu, and write while her daughter napped beside her. Those hours became small lifelines, pockets of creativity and hope in an otherwise grinding. Routine, heartbreak, had reshaped her life in brutal ways, but it had also stripped away everything that was unnecessary. There was no room for illusions anymore. What remained was her daughter, her determination, and the world she was building on paper. She didn't know yet that those pages would change everything. For now, they were just words, scribbled between feedings and nap times. But in the silence of her little flat, she was quietly laying the foundation for a story that would lift them both out of poverty and into a life neither of them could yet imagine. The winter mornings in Edinburgh were a kind of cold that seeped straight into your bones. Even indoors, the chill found its way through the thin walls of Joanne's small flat, curling around her ankles and making the air feel heavier than it should. The heating system groaned like an old man clearing his throat, as she had learned to ration it carefully, heat in short bursts. Sweaters layered one over the other, a hot water bottle under the blanket at night. But there was one place in the city where warmth was guaranteed, the cafes. They were her escape, her refuge, her makeshift office. By then, Jessica was a little older, still a baby, but with a growing curiosity about the world. Joanne had perfected the art of bundling her up against the wind, a wool hat that flopped over her forehead, a scarf tucked snug under her chin. Layers upon layers of soft clothes. The pram creaked as Joanne pushed it down the cobbled streets, her breath puffing out in small clouds. She had no money for luxury. Every coin mattered. But she discovered a trick that would become part of her survival routine. For the price of the cheapest coffee or tea, she could sit in a cafe for hours. As long as she stayed quiet and kept to herself, the staff, sometimes curious, sometimes indifferent, came to recognize her, the woman with the baby and the battered notebooks. She'd choose her table carefully, always the same kind, close to the wall, near a window if possible, where the light could fall on her pages and she could watch people passing by outside. The hum of conversation around her became a kind of protective bubble, a background noise that made the silence in her head feel less sharp. Jessica would nap in the pram, her soft breathing Cincy with the scratch of Joanne's pen. There was number laptop then, no fancy writing software, just spiral notebooks, cheap pens, and the stubborn belief that this story she was shaping mattered. She wrote in longhand, the words spilling out faster than she could always keep up. Sometimes a scene would seize her so strongly that she forgot the cafe, the cold outside, even her own hunger. The boy wizard was alive in her mind, wandering through a castle of moving staircases, learning about a world that was hidden in plain sight. She would smile to herself when a line came out exactly as she imagined it, or frown and cross it out with quick, impatient strokes when it did in single quotes t. Not all days were good days. There were mornings when Jessica fussed and refused to nap, when the pen felt heavy in her hand, when the cold followed her inside no matter how much tea she drank. On those days, Joanne would push herself to write even just a few lines, telling herself that progress, no matter how small, was still progress. Money was still painfully tight. She'd count her coins at the counter before ordering, aware of the eyes of people in line behind her. Sometimes she'd nurse a single cup of tea for 3 hours, taking tiny sips so it wouldn't run out too soon. But she told herself that it was worth it. These hours in the cafes were more than just writing sessions. They were a statement. I am still here. I am still building something. Occasionally, strangers would glance at her, curious. A young mother, writing furiously while her baby slept, was not a common sight. Once, an older woman leaned over with a kind smile and said, writing a novel. Dear. Joanne had laughed quietly, a little shyly, and answered, trying to. She didn't explain what the story was. Not yet. When Jessica woke, Joanne would feed her, change her, and then sometimes sit her on her lap while she continued writing. Jessica's small hands would reach for the pen, smudging the ink or tugging at the paper, and Joanne would laugh softly, in a strange way. Her daughter was part of the process, part of every word that appeared on the page. The cafes became not just places of work, but markers of her journey. There was the one with the dark wood paneling where she first wrote about the Sorting Hat, the one with the tall windows where she imagined the train steaming away from platform 9 3/4, the one tucked into a quiet corner of the city where she gave Harry his first Quidditch match. The city outside changed with the seasons. In spring, the streets were lined with flowers and tourists with cameras. In summer, the days stretched long, and she'd sometimes sit outside with her notebook, Jessica babbling beside her. In autumn, the leaves turned gold and crunched under the pram wheels. And in winter, the wind howled, and she'd hurry into the warm cafes with fingers numb from the cold. Through it all, the manuscript grew, page by page, scene by scene. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was alive. And so was she. Looking back, she would one day realize that these years of writing in cafes weren't just about finishing a book. They were about proving to herself that even when life stripped her down to almost nothing, she could still create something magical. And in those quiet hours, surrounded by the smell of coffee and the sound of strangers' voices, Joanne was building not just a story, but the bridge to a future that she and Jessica would one day walk across together. For months, the manuscript sat like a fragile secret in Joanne's small flat pages stacked neatly, their edges curling slightly from all the handling. She had read and reread it so many times that she could recite whole paragraphs by heart. She had smoothed creases, replaced faded ink with fresh words, and gone back over certain chapters until they felt as sharp and alive as she could make them. It was, in every sense, a part of her, a piece of her own survival pressed into paper. And now came the terrifying part, letting it go. She had read about how brutal the publishing world could be. She'd heard the story's manuscripts rejected dozens of times, letters of thank you, but no that crushed dreams in a single paragraph. She told herself she was ready for that possibility, but deep down, she knew that each rejection would feel like a rejection of her, not just her work. The process was daunting. First, she needed an agent, someone who believed in her enough to fight for the book. She spent long nights poring over lists of literary agencies, scribbling down names, addresses, and submission requirements. Some wanted just a synopsis, others the first 3 chapters, others the entire manuscript. She typed each letter carefully, printing them on the cheapest paper she could afford, making sure not a single comma was out of place. The first batch of queries went out in plain brown envelopes, each one carrying a small piece of her hope. She would drop them into the postbox and then walk away quickly, as if not watching them leave would make the waiting easier. The waiting, of course, was the worst part. Days turned into weeks. Weeks stretched into months, and then the rejections began to trickle in. Some were polite and encouraging. "Thank you for your submission. Unfortunately, it's not the right fit for us at this time." Others were blunt and cold, just a few lines that might as well have been pre-printed. Each one hit her like a small blow, but she forced herself to keep going. Then came the day when she opened an envelope and read words that stopped her cold. "We'd like to see the full manuscript." Her heart pounded. She sat at the small kitchen table, the letter trembling in her hands. Someone wanted to see it. Someone had read her opening chapters and thought they were worth more time. She mailed the full manuscript the very next day, packing it carefully as if it were glass. But still more waiting. Weeks later, the call came. She had been standing in her cramped hallway, balancing Jessica on her hip, when the phone rang. The voice on the other end introduced herself as Christopher Little's assistant. "We'd like to represent you," the woman said. Joanne almost didn't believe it. She asked her to repeat it, just to make sure she wasn't imagining things. Representation meant she now had someone in her corner, someone who would take her manuscript to publishers and fight for it. It was the first real validation that all those hours in the cafes, all those nights of writing through exhaustion, had been worth something. But the battle was far from over. Christopher Little's agency began sending the manuscript to publishers, and again the rejections came. Some found the story too long for a children's book. Others didn't believe it would sell. Joanne listened as the no's piled up, each one another reminder of how uncertain this road was. And then months later, another phone call. She had been out walking Jessica in the pram when the mobile buzzed. She ducked into a doorway to hear better as Christopher's voice came through, warm with barely contained excitement. "Bloomsbury wants it," he said. "They're offering a small advance, but they're ready to publish." The word seemed to hang in the air, almost too good to touch. Bloomsbury, a real publisher. A book in print. Her book. The advance was modest, barely enough to cover a few months' expenses, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that the world was finally going to meet Harry Potter. When she hung up, she stood there for a long moment, her breath misting in the cool air. She looked down at Jessica, who was blinking up at her with wide, curious eyes. "We did it," she whispered, her voice shaking. "We really did it." That night, she spread the contract out on the kitchen table. The paper was crisp, the ink fresh, and as she signed her name, she felt a strange mixture of relief, joy, and quiet determination. This was not the end of the journey. It was just the first bridge to the life she had been fighting for. Somewhere deep down, she knew this was the moment everything would change. When the first boxes of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone arrived at the Bloomsbury offices, the smell of freshly printed pages seemed to hold the weight of 1,000 untold dreams. Joanne didn't see them right away. She was at home, feeding Jessica mashed carrots, when the call came. "Your author copies are ready." The next day, she walked into the publisher's modest office, her heart beating fast. And there was her name on a book spine. J.K. Rowling. The cover illustration, simple yet magical, seemed to hum with life. She ran her fingers over the raised letters, half expecting them to vanish under her touch. She'd been warned not to expect much. Children's books rarely made headlines. Sales would be slow at first, they said. They printed only a few hundred hardback copies. In fact, the first print run was so small that no one, least of all Joanne, could have predicted what was coming. The early days were quiet. She did small signings at local bookstores, often sitting for hours with only a handful of children and parents passing by. Some kids would flip through the book and wander off without buying it. She smiled anyway, chatting with anyone who stopped. She remembered what it felt like to be invisible, and she wanted no one to feel that way in her presence. Then came the first review in The Guardian. The critic praised her imagination, the charm of her storytelling, and the depth of her characters. A few days later, another glowing review appeared, and then another. Teachers began recommending it to their students. Librarians started ordering more copies. Parents who bought it for their children found themselves reading ahead after bedtime. Slowly, the ripples began to spread. A few months later, Bloomsbury called with news. Scholastic, a major U.S. publisher, had bought the American rights at auction for an unheard of sum for a debut children's book. Joanne sat in stunned silence, listening to the figure being read over the phone. She could feel her life pivoting in real time. When Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone hit American shelves, the response was instant and electric. School libraries had waiting lists for it. Teachers incorporated it into reading programs. Kids who claimed they hated reading suddenly couldn't put it down. Letters began arriving handwritten, in crayon, on lined notebook paper thanking her for making them love books again. And then came the first award, then the second, then a cascade of them. The story wasn't just selling, it was becoming a movement. By the time the second book, The Chamber of Secrets, was released, the lines at signings stretched out the door and around the block. Joanne, still unused to the idea of fame, found herself meeting fans who knew more about her characters than she'd ever imagined. Some brought her fan art, others came dressed as wizards and witches. The third book launch was an outright cultural event. Midnight release parties were now a thing. Bookstores filled with children in robes and glasses, lightning bolts drawn on their foreheads, chanting the countdown to midnight as if waiting for New Year's Eve. Reporters covered the phenomenon. TV cameras rolled. Joanne watched it all with a strange mixture of joy and disbelief. She remembered, with almost painful clarity, the years when she couldn't afford heating, when she'd sit in a cafe nursing a single coffee just to keep writing. Now, her words had crossed oceans, lit up imaginations, and brought strangers together in a shared dream. But fame came with its own storm. Paparazzi began waiting outside her home. Articles picked apart her life. Every word she said in interviews was scrutinized. She tried to shield Jessica from it, keeping their life as normal as possible. But the world's hunger for more of Harry Potter and more of Joanne was insatiable. Yet, when she sat down at her desk, pen in hand, all of that faded away. She was back in the world she had built, with Harry, Ron, and Hermione waiting for her to continue the journey. The pressure was enormous. Millions now waited for her next sentence. But the joy of creation was still there, burning quietly, steadily, in her chest. From an unknown single mother to one of the most recognized authors in the world, the transformation had been rapid and surreal. But in her heart, Joanne knew the core truth: the fame, the money, the awards, none of that had been the goal. The goal had always been the same: to tell a story worth believing in. And now, the whole world believed. The flashbulbs didn't stop anymore. Wherever Joanne went, airports, restaurants, even school events for Jessica, someone was watching, recording, clicking a camera. The gentle anonymity she once had was gone, replaced by a constant hum of attention that felt like static in her ears. In the beginning, she tried to brush it off, smiling politely, posing for photos, signing autographs in grocery store aisles. But as Harry Potter's world grew, so did the frenzy. Reporters camped outside her home. Strangers knocked on her door asking for book signings or money. Tabloid headlines spun rumors out of thin air about her relationships, her parenting, even her mental health. Some days, the noise seeped into her writing. She'd sit at her desk, pen poised over paper, but the words would tangle with the latest gossip piece she'd read about herself. That morning, it was as if the world was holding her characters hostage, demanded she release the next book faster, bigger, better. And then came the legal battles. Someone had tried to publish a knockoff of Harry Potter, barely disguised, hoping to ride the wave of her success. Another time, her own words were misquoted in an interview, sparking outrage in countries she'd never even visited. Each situation meant lawyers, statements, long hours of stress that pulled her away from the thing she loved most: writing. Even her health began to feel the weight of fame. Exhaustion crept in like fog. There were days when the pressure of delivering another hit felt physically crushing. She'd wake in the middle of the night, heart pounding, thinking of millions of expected readers, of the headlines that would scream if she ever faltered. But perhaps the hardest blow came in her personal life. Her marriage to Neil, though filled with love in its early days, began to strain under the glare of public life. Simple moments, walking in the park, having a quiet dinner, were interrupted by fans or paparazzi. Arguments started over little things, but the truth was, they were both feeling the pressure of being half of J.K. Rowling's life. The eventual separation left her raw, a reminder that even in the height of achievement, loss could find its way in. Through it all, there was still Jessica and now her younger children. Joanne clung to her role as their mother with fierce determination. She set boundaries, refused certain interviews, declined public events if they interfered with school plays or bedtime stories. In the chaos of fame, her children became her anchor, reminding her of the life she'd once dreamed of: a safe home, love, and the freedom to write. But she knew she couldn't let the challenges consume her. She had built this life on resilience, on refusing to quit when quitting would have been easy. She returned to her desk each morning, even when her mind was clouded, even when the phone wouldn't stop ringing. When she opened her notebook, the world outside faded. The characters still spoke to her in quiet voices, urging her forward. They weren't just hers anymore, they belonged to every child who stayed up late reading by flashlight, to every adult rediscovering wonder, to every dreamer who needed proof that magic could exist in ordinary lives. And so she pushed through. The storms of fame, the invasive press, the personal heartbreak, they were heavy. But she carried them, because she understood something that success had taught her. Reaching the peak didn't mean the climb was over. It just meant the air was thinner, and you had to breathe harder to keep going. In the stillness of her study, Joan would sometimes look at the framed first edition of her debut novel on the wall. It reminded her where she had come from, the cafe with the chipped mugs, the welfare office, the nights she cried alone over rejection letters. If she had survived that, she could survive this. And as the world clamored for the next chapter in Harry Potter's journey, she knew she wasn't just writing a book. She was proving to herself and to anyone watching that the magic that had brought her here was still alive. The night was quiet, save for the soft scratching of her pen on paper. Joan sat hunched at her desk, her study dimly lit by a single lamp. The world outside was asleep, but in her mind, a storm of emotion raged. 7 books, more than a decade, hundreds of millions of readers, and now, just a few pages stood between her and the final words she would ever write for Harry Potter. She stared at the sentence forming under her hand, her breath catching. For so long, Harry had been more than a character, he had been a companion through the hardest and brightest moments of her life. She'd written his beginnings in a cramped Edinburgh flat while the bills piled up. She'd sent him to battle Voldemort while she battled her own fears. He'd grown older as Jessica did, and in some ways, he had raised her, too, shaping her as a writer, a mother, a woman. Her pen hovered in the air. She could hear the echo of a cafe door closing behind her, smell the coffee that had gone cold. Beside her manuscript in those early days, she remembered Jessica coloring at the corner table while she scribbled down Quidditch matches and spells. She remembered rejection letters that told her no one will read this. And now, the whole world was waiting to see how it ended. When the final paragraph came, she wrote it slowly, almost reluctantly. Each word felt like a goodbye she wasn't ready to say. She paused after the last sentence, reading it aloud in a whisper. Her voice cracked. Tears spilled freely, smudging the ink on the page. It was over. But in the stillness of that moment, a strange peace settled over her. The story was complete. Harry had made it home. So had she. The next day, she walked into her publisher's office carrying the manuscript in a plain folder. As if it were any ordinary document, her editors greeted her with quiet reverence. Aware of the weight of what she was handing over, she placed it on the table and let her hands linger there a moment longer before stepping back. Later, when she returned home, the emptiness hit her like a wave. No more late nights with Harry and Hermione, no more plot knots to untangle over tea. Her study felt silent in a way it hadn't for years, and yet, as the days passed, she realized Harry wasn't truly gone. He lived in every reader's imagination, in every child dressing up in wizard robes, in every dog-eared copy sitting on a bedside table. He was in the letters she still received from fans, letters telling her how his courage had inspired theirs, how his battles had helped them through their own. The farewell was bittersweet, but it was also a beginning. Joan knew she would write other stories, explore other worlds, but nothing would ever quite be like this journey. And she was okay with that. On a rainy evening not long after, she sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching droplets race each other down the glass. Somewhere in the world, a child was turning the first page of the Philosopher's Stone. Somewhere else, another was closing the Deathly Hallows for the first time, blinking back tears. And she smiled, because the magic would go on long after she had written the final word. The applause was still ringing in her ears. The book tours, the movie premieres, the award ceremonies, they had all become part of her life, but she knew they weren't the point. Fame had never been the goal. She remembered vividly the days when she was counting coins to buy one more cup of coffee in a cafe so she could keep writing, without being asked to leave. That hunger, not for money, but for meaning, still burned inside her. Now she had more money than she could ever spend in a lifetime. But with that came a heavier responsibility. What was she going to do with it? She sat in her London home one rainy afternoon, papers spread across the kitchen table. Not manuscripts this time, but letters from charities, proposals for projects, stories of children and families in desperate need. She read them slowly, her heart heavy, war-torn villages. Parents working 3 jobs and still unable to afford medicine for their kids. Children growing up in homes where there was no warmth, no safety. It was impossible to help everyone, but it was impossible to do nothing. Her thoughts kept returning to her own past. The years when she was a single mother with a baby on her hip, trying to make rent. The way poverty wrapped around you like a cold you couldn't shake, making you feel small and invisible. She knew what it was like to be overlooked, and she vowed she wouldn't overlook others now that she was in a position to help. And so, the first seeds of the Lumos Foundation began to take root. The vision was clear: to fight for children trapped in institutional care, to give them the chance to grow up in safe, loving families instead of orphanages. She poured not just money, but her voice into the mission. She wrote passionate appeals, met with world leaders, stood in front of cameras not to promote books, but to tell stories of real children whose lives could be transformed. Her fame became a spotlight, one she turned deliberately onto issues most people wanted to look away from. Reporters expecting playful anecdotes about wands and magic instead found themselves listening to her describe the harsh reality of children living without love and how society could change that. Some criticized her for being too political. Others said she was distracting from her writing. But she didn't care. She had faced worse criticism when she was unknown, and now she had a platform that could reach millions. Years passed, and the impact of her work began to ripple outwards. Countries reformed their child welfare systems. Families were reunited. Children who might have grown up in the shadows were instead running in open fields, laughing under the sun. And still, she remained grounded. She shopped at the same grocery store, wore coats she'd owned for years, and kept her circle of trust small. She knew wealth and fame could warp people if they weren't careful, and she guarded her heart against that by keeping her focus outward, on the ones who needed help the most. On a quiet evening, she opened a letter from a young woman who had grown up in an orphanage, but was now studying to be a social worker because of Lumos. The girl wrote, "I was given a family. Now, I want to give the same to others." Joan set the letter down, her eyes stinging with tears. This was it. This was why the long nights, the rejections, the struggle had all been worth it. Fame could fade, money could be lost, but the lives she touched, those were forever. The first time she saw her name trending on social media, it was for something wonderful. A book release, a movie premiere, an award speech. The next time, it was different. She sat at her desk, phone in hand, scrolling through a storm of messages. Headlines blared across the internet, words twisted, sentences pulled from context, opinions fired like arrows, some so sharp they made her chest tighten. It was strange. She had faced years of rejection in her early career without flinching, but this was different. This wasn't a private letter from a publisher saying no thank you. This was public, loud, unrelenting, and it came not from faceless corporations, but from people, readers, journalists, strangers, some of whom once claimed to love her work. She had always been outspoken. Her life had taught her that silence, in the face of injustice, was a kind of surrender. But now she was learning the price of speaking up in a world that could amplify a single sentence into a global roar. Her team told her to step back. Don't read the comments, they said. Let it blow over. But she was a writer. Words mattered to her, and it was impossible not to see how quickly they could be reshaped into something unrecognizable. At night, she lay awake in the dim glow of her bedroom lamp, asking herself the hard questions. Had she failed someone? Had she misunderstood? Was she being misunderstood? In the quiet hours, she found no simple answers. Some of her oldest friends reminded her of the bigger picture. Remember, one told her over tea, the world is loud, but loud doesn't always mean right. She thought about that a lot, how voices could drown out nuance, how disagreement could turn into hatred, how once you were famous, people didn't just read your books, they read you. She couldn't undo her fame. She couldn't erase the fact that millions knew her name and felt some claim to her story. But she could decide how to move forward. So she went back to the page, not for the world this time, but for herself. Writing had always been the place where she could think clearly, away from the noise. She filled journal after journal with raw, unfiltered thoughts, trying to make sense of the shifting ground beneath her feet. The controversy didn't disappear. Some bridges burned, others stood, though charred at the edges, and she learned to accept that no story, not even her own, would be universally loved. What mattered most was the same thing that had mattered. When she was a single mother scribbling ideas in a cafe, staying true to her own voice. If she started writing for approval, she would lose the very thing that had carried her through the hardest years. She realized something else, too. The criticism meant she was still part of the conversation. She still had a voice that people heard, and while that came with risk, it also came with responsibility. And so, she stood back up. She kept speaking, kept writing, kept giving, even knowing that every word might be praised by some and condemned by others. It wasn't about being liked anymore. It was about being honest. The rain fell softly over Edinburgh, blurring the city lights into watercolor smears. She stood at her window, watching droplets race each other down the glass, thinking of how far she'd come and how far her words had traveled. It was a strange thing, legacy. You couldn't see it the way you saw a bank balance or a house or a trophy on a shelf. It was invisible, woven quietly into the hearts and lives of others. Yet it was real, more real than anything she could hold. Every week, letters still arrived. Some were from children who had just discovered her books, their handwriting clumsy and eager. Others came from adults who had grown up with her stories and wanted her to know that the courage, loyalty, and hope they had read on the page had followed them into real life. One woman wrote that her book had saved her during a dark time. A man said it had given him the strength to speak out against bullying. And then there were the schools, hundreds of them. Libraries with her characters painted on the walls. Community centers using her stories to teach reading, empathy, and imagination. She had started small. One person, one typewriter, one idea, and somehow it had become something that would outlive her. But she knew legacy wasn't just about books sold or movies made. It was about the kind of life you left behind. She remembered those early years, the single mother with coins counted out for coffee, the rejection letters, the moments of nearly giving up. She wanted her life to tell people one thing, that your circumstances are not your sentence. That's why she poured herself into philanthropy, literacy programs, children's hospitals, research for diseases few wanted to talk about. She didn't need her name on everything. She just needed the work to happen, the kind of work that might mean, years from now, some other struggling parent would have a place to turn. There were still moments when the fame felt heavy, when she longed for the quiet life she once had. But she also knew she could never trade away the impact her voice had made. Stories had power. They could light up the darkest corners. They could outlive the person who wrote them. One afternoon, she visited a small library in a town she'd never been to. The walls were lined with well-worn books, some with her name on the spine. A little girl, maybe 8 years old, came up to her without hesitation. "Your book made me feel brave," the girl said simply, then darted off before she could respond, and that was it. That was the whole reason, not the awards, not the box office numbers, not the headlines. That one sentence, "You made me feel brave," was worth more than anything else. As night settled in, she returned to her desk, opening a fresh notebook. The page stared back at her, empty and waiting. She smiled. There were still stories to tell, and if she was lucky, those stories would keep traveling, long after she was gone. The room was quiet except for the soft scratching of her pen against paper. It was late, the kind of late where the world outside seemed to hold its breath. She looked at the words forming beneath her hand and thought of the long, crooked road that had brought her here. It was almost impossible to believe it now. But there had been a time when she'd sat on the edge of her bed, head in her hands, wondering if there was any point in going on. Nights when the fridge was nearly empty, when the electricity bill glared from the table, when the rejections piled high enough to feel like a wall she'd never climb over. And yet, she had kept going, not because she was sure she'd succeed. She hadn't been. Not because the odds were in her favor. They hadn't been. She had kept going because something deep inside whispered that her story mattered, even if nobody else believed it yet. Now, looking back, she could see that persistence wasn't just a virtue. It was a weapon. It was the one thing you could wield when everything else had been stripped away. It was the bridge between impossible and done. In her speeches, she often told people, "You don't fail by falling down. You fail by staying down." And she meant it. Every no she received had shaped her resilience. Every empty pocket had sharpened her hunger. Every lonely night at the cafe had taught her that even in the smallest, quietest places, magic could be born. The truth was, her success was never just about talent. It was about endurance, the willingness to keep showing up at the page, to keep sending the manuscript, to keep believing when no one else did. That was the real spell, not the kind in her books, but the kind in life. She thought of the single mother at the kitchen table, the one she used to be. She wanted to reach back through time and tell her, "You're going to make it." Not because it will be easy, it won't, but because you won't stop. Outside, the first light of dawn was spilling over the city, painting the rooftops gold. She put down her pen and watched the sun rise. Another day was beginning, another chance to write, to speak, to live the lesson she had learned, that no matter where you start, no matter how many times you fall, as long as you keep moving forward, you're already winning. And somewhere, perhaps in a tiny flat above a noisy street, someone else was holding a dream in their hands, wondering if it was worth fighting for. She hoped they'd hear her story and know the answer. Never give up, because the moment you stop believing is the moment the magic ends. And as she had proven, magic, real magic, belongs to those who refuse to quit. Throughout J.K. Rowling's journey, there are key moments where language paints powerful pictures and teaches us how to express resilience. Let's explore some useful vocabulary and expressions from her story. Rock bottom. This phrase means the lowest point in someone's life. When Rowling was living in a small apartment, struggling as a single mother, she often said she had hit rock bottom. Example, after losing my job, I felt like I'd hit rock bottom, but it became the foundation for my comeback. Against all odds, this means achieving something despite very low chances of success. Rowling's manuscript was rejected multiple times, yet she succeeded against all odds. Example, the team won the championship against all odds. Turning point, the moment something changes dramatically. For Rowling, getting her first book deal was the turning point of her career. Example, graduating from university was a turning point in my life. To weather the storm, to survive difficult times without giving up. Rowling weathered the storm of rejection and poverty before her success. Example, we had to weather the storm of financial crisis, but we came out stronger. Perseverance, the determination to keep going despite difficulties. Rowling's entire journey is a lesson in perseverance. Example, with perseverance, even the tallest mountain can be climbed. From Rowling's journey, here are lessons you can apply to your own life. Your lowest point can be the start of your greatest rise. Hitting rock bottom doesn't mean the end. It often means a new beginning. Persistence beats talent when talent doesn't persist. Keep showing up, even when no one believes in you. Rejection is redirection. Every no brings you closer to the yes that changes everything. Use your pain as fuel for creativity. Your struggles can become the most powerful part of your story. Protect your vision until it becomes reality. The world might not see your dream yet, but that doesn't mean it's not worth fighting for. Imagine if she had given up after the first rejection, or the fifth, or the 10th. Imagine if she had let poverty, fear, or doubt silence her voice. The world would have lost not just a best-selling author, but a story that inspired millions to believe in magic, both on the page and in their own lives. Your journey might not be easy. It might test you in ways you never expected, but if you can keep moving forward, one step, one page, one dream at a time, you are already shaping a future you can't yet see. As J.K. Rowling proved, the magic isn't in avoiding failure, it's in refusing to quit.